Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Alice, for that generous introduction. I'm really delighted because I understand that there are a good number of people with us in the virtual room. Obviously, it would have been really nice to meet all of you in person, but this is the best we can do. So I'm very thrilled that we can have this armchair event and at least be together virtually. In terms of what I want to do in my talk today, obviously, it's based on my new book, The Shifting Border, Legal Cartographies of Migration and Mobility. And this book, in terms of timing, was published literally a few days before COVID-19 took hold in Europe and in North America. And what I want us to do in the short time that we have together is I want to give you a gist of the argument. That's what I'll do in the first part of my talk. Then I'm going to describe to you in some detail 3 examples that I explore in the book that explain and illustrate the shifting border concept. And then in the last part, as time permits, I also want to talk to you a little bit about the recent developments. That is how I see the COVID-19 responses, border-related responses, as correlating, building upon, and accentuating the kind of shifting border techniques and developments that we have seen prior to the pandemic. So this is what we are planning to do. In terms of my own background, it's in law and political science and political theory, so I'll try and bring both the legal perspective and the normative one. And obviously, I'm just going to present a little part of the book. Please ask me if you have any questions that I have not covered in the talk. You're most welcome to just raise them during the Q&A. But in terms of the legal component, what I want to do is I want to explain to you how the basic tools of public law, which is typically legislation, regulation, case law, have become central tools in really reinventing certain dimensions of sovereignty, and specifically I will talk about territoriality and border control. Both of them are very, very significant for statehood and statecraft. So let us begin. If I ask you to close your eyes and imagine a border, what image would come to mind? I think that most of us would think of a border as a line on a map or a physical barrier that's firmly planted on the edge of the territory. And if you want to think about examples, the Great Wall of China is a classic manifestation of this vision of the border. It's fixed, it's massive, and it's also a powerful symbol of sovereign control and authority. Another example would be the Berlin Wall, which of course was fortified, it was visible, it ran like a scar in the heart of a divided city. And not only that, the Berlin Wall was actually a violent border wall. It was violent in the sense that the border guards operating there were instructed to shoot anyone who came close to the border within its proximity without authorization. So this is a kind of classic image that we have of the border. And in 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, many at the time, and this might, now our reality is so different, but at the time, late end of the 20th century, let's put it this way, many had predicted that closed borders would soon become relics of a bygone era. And of course, today, we find a very, very different reality. We find a different reality in the sense that new border walls are being built in accelerated speed throughout the world. So this is still within the image of the physical fortified border. But what I want to share with you is actually a new trend, and it's new and it's striking, and it has emerged in the past few decades. And that is what I will refer to as the rise of sophisticated, invisible borders, borders that rely on shrewd legal techniques to create a whole new conception of the border, which I call in the book the shifting border. And the shifting border, unlike the traditional static barrier that we have just described, is not fixed in time and place. Instead, what's unique to this border or this bordering set of techniques is that the border is in flux. That is, it may penetrate deep into the interior, and I'll provide you a couple of examples of that, just as it may stretch far, far away, way beyond the territory, operating potentially tens, hundreds, or even thousands of kilometers away from the actual protected territory. And by detaching migration control from a fixed territorial marker, the shifting border provides tremendous latitude to governments and states acting alone or in concert, and in some cases even through international organizations. So this is really a new technique of bordering. Also now, currently, we're seeing a tremendous amount of private actors who are taking part in this new framework of the shifting border. And as I show in the book, one of the most remarkable, really, developments of recent years is that the border itself has become a moving barrier, an unmoored legal construct. So the kind of fixed black lines that we see in the World Atlas, they're still there in the Atlas, but they really no longer coincide with the rise of what has been referred to as remote control migration functions that may potentially, and this is crucial, may potentially operate anywhere in the world. So the function is similar. It's to control entry, to decide who may come in, who may not, who may be held at bay, but the location has dramatically shifted. And I want to suggest to you that these developments are significant because they challenge our most basic assumptions on two grounds. They challenge the assumption about waning sovereignty, which, as I said, was a very, very strong theoretical trend that we have seen in the late 1980s, 1990s. So the idea of the demise of states, I think, is refuted by the kind of evidence that I will describe to you, but it's also revealing because it shows the limits of the nationalist populist push, which we're now seeing in the past few years of refortifying border walls. So these border walls are very symbolic politically, but in terms of the function, the work of regulating mobility, the shifting border has really taken over in the sense of its significance and impact. And as the examples that I will share with you momentarily illustrate, the shifting border is comprised of what I will refer to as legal portals rather than fences, walls, and gates. So this is its contrast with the fixed border that we have started our discussion with. And the point that I want to emphasize at this point before we turn to the examples is that the location of the border is shifting. That is, because it is shifting, it significantly expands the locus and focus of migration control. And instead of barbed wires, what the shifting border, the reason why it's so agile, the reason why it's so mobile is because it relies on laws admission gates, which permit it to contract inward, to extend outward, to appear, to reappear, to disappear. I'll give you some examples of the latter, and with very dramatic implications for the scope of rights and protections that migrants and non-citizens may enjoy. And one last point before I turn to the examples. Until recently, the kind of flexible, stretchable tentacles of the shifting border that I will describe to you were deployed primarily to monitor people on the move, especially those escaping poverty, persecution, and instability. Now, what's distinctive, and this is where I want to get to COVID-19 when towards the end of my talk, is that today everyone, that is everyone, including citizens of wealthy democracies such as Canada, the UK, etc., is potentially within the ever-expanding reach of the shifting border. And indeed, I believe that the responses to the global pandemic have further accelerated this trend. And as I mentioned, I'll aim to return to this towards the end of my talk. All right, so let us turn to a few examples. So first of all, I want to share with you the cover of the book. Very beautiful. Thank you to Manchester University Press for producing it in such an elegant way. And in terms of our examples, I'm just going to shift to that. My first example comes to us from the United States. So here I'll just give you a little bit of background. So as part of a change to US immigration law, a procedure called expedited removal was introduced into that regulation. Now, this legal provision permits frontline officers not only to, as the name tells you, expeditiously remove individuals who are tracked at the border, but, and this is more significant for our shifting border analysis, also this new regulation permits border officials to review the legal status of individuals detected up to 100 miles away from the US land and coastal borders, in effect, moving the border from its fixed location at the country's territorial edges into the interior. So if you look at the image that we have on the screen, this is the orange rim is the 100-mile zone that I have just described to you. Now, this legal authorization not only relocates the border physically, but it also creates what has been referred to as a constitution-free or constitution-light zone within the United States, allowing law enforcement agents to set up random checkpoints, that is even without a need to prove probable cause. And these checkups can take place on highways, ferries, on trains, and they permit the authorities to ask any random person to provide proof of their legal status to remain in the United States. Now, we're used to such governmental surveillance of movement and mobility, but it's traditionally limited. It's restricted to the actual moment of crossing a border, right? That's when we typically would have to show some kind of formal identification, such as a passport. But what is distinctive here is that this kind of regulation is now spilling into the interior. Now, if you think that this 100-mile zone is not particularly impressive to you, that is, you might say, sure, we are already used to regulation. Does it really matter if it now occurs within this orange ring that we see on the screen? If you think it's insignificant, I would definitely urge you to think again. Why do I say this? Because the most recent US official data, census data, would reveal that 2/3 of the US population actually resides within this 100-mile zone. And another way to slice this data would be to share with you the fact that more than 200 million people live in this malleable or movable border zone. So if you want more concrete examples, the bulk of the state of New York lies within the 100-mile zone. Florida, which again is a very significant country, state for immigrants, it has a large immigrant population, also fits within the 100-mile zone. And the governmental agency responsible for managing the shifting border in the United States, that's the Department of Homeland Security, has actually gone on record already back in the early 2000s declaring that from its perspective, its border enforcement perspective, these measures may well extend nationwide. Now, this idea really that the shifting border might apply nationwide was until very recently thought of as an idea that squarely lies in the realm of science fiction. No longer. In July 2019, that is a month before the outbreak of the coronavirus, the Trump administration issued a new rule authorizing such massive nationwide expansion, meaning that any person caught anywhere within the United States without authorization may expeditiously be removed. And not only has the spatial component of expedited removal been expanded, but also the temporal impact. So if you're in the country without authorization, even for a period of up to 2 years, still this legal provision permits the authorities to expeditiously remove you. And to a great extent, conceptually, beyond the obvious significance in terms of rights and protections that individuals have, conceptually, what this move does is it blurs the distinction between the interior and the exterior, at least for immigration regulation purposes. So really, this is one dramatic example of which I wanted to share with you. Let's just move along to a second example, which I described in the book. And this is an example from Canada. So Canada has really perfected the technique of interdiction abroad, effectively relocating much of its immigration regulation activities to overseas gateways, primarily located in Europe and in Asia, where migration integrity officers, or sometimes they're referred to as liaison officers, now conduct border control activities as a matter of course. And they also delegate some of this work to third parties. These are commercial parties or private actors, such as airline personnel. So whereas in the United States, the example we have seen is of the border bleeding into the interior, here in this example, the Canadian example, the border actually stretches out well beyond the territorial frontiers of the relevant country. And this is part of a shifting border strategy that, as official government policy documents actually plainly and quite tellingly explain, the idea is to push the border out as far away as possible from the actual territorial border. So this is the logic of the shifting border, very nicely, very crystallized in this government document. And the idea, which is enthusiastically endorsed by governments throughout the world now, is to screen people at the source or at the origin before they start their journey. So rather than regulating people at the destination country, which used to be the traditional way of doing regulation of mobility, now people are regulated as close as possible to the start of their journey, the origin of their journey. And then again, as you can see actually on the screen, the idea is to regulate mobility at every possible checkpoint along the travel continuum. Again, this is a quote from the official documentation. That is prior to arrival, through visa screening, airport check-in, point of embarkation, transit points, international airports, and then, and this is really dramatic, after arrival. That is, once you're in the territory, you might still be regulated. And this again is something that has will prove momentarily very significant to the kind of trends that we're seeing post-COVID or during the COVID pandemic. So the traditional border, that is the idea of a static border, is now reimagined as the last point of encounter rather than the first. Now, just because I mentioned COVID, the same logic of extending the long arm of the state that is regulating from afar has also informed the Canadian government's response to the current global pandemic. In mid-March, when it became clear that the virus was no longer containable in one country or one region, Canada responded quite decisively by taking unilateral action. And on March 16, Canada placed a global travel ban, which came into effect on March 18 and is still with us today. And more specifically, in line with the shifting border logic, what Canada has done is it delegated to airline authorities abroad the task of screening people before they boarded a plane that's bounded towards Canada, and has further instructed these airline and airport personnel to prohibit individuals, including Canadian citizens. This is really quite significant in the sense of the citizenship theory, from boarding a flight towards Canada if they present any COVID-19 symptoms. So this is the kind of response. It's a response which really shields the country and removes border protection and regulation and mobility control as far away as possible from the actual territorial border. Now, I want to suggest to you that this move is significant, as we said, spatially, but it's also significant in terms of accountability, because if a government official, if a border agent screens you and decides, for example, not to permit you admission, they have to provide reasons. There's a legal procedure to review that. But if it's a private sector operator which decides that you are not fit to go on a plane, there's very little that you can do in terms of a recourse. So really, we're being challenged here with very significant questions of accountability, transparency, potential risk of bias. And these are some concerns which, again, have become even more pronounced, given that now we're talking about a significant role being played not just by airline companies, but also by tech companies, if we're thinking about processes of digital tracing and tracking in the current era. So this is the kind of new world that we're facing. Just in the interest of time, I want to turn to a third and final example that I discuss in the book, and this comes to us from Australia. So again, please look at the screen. Australia, even more explicitly than Canada and the United States, has officially relocated its border through the words of law. That is creating, as its government readily admits, a distinction between the country's migration zone and Australia as we know it on the map. Now, the migration zone are these yellow bubbles that you're seeing on the map itself. Now, this particular policy, referred to as the excision policy, was created through law. That is, it was created through the Migration Amendment Act of 2001, later amendment in 2005, and then again in 2013. And this legislation authorizes Australia's immigration official to remove asylum seekers that have managed to reach its excised territory, that is, again, those yellow parts that you see on the map, as if, and this is really quite striking, as if they have never reached Australia, although physically they landed on its shores. So this is what in law we would refer to as a legal fiction. That is, the idea is that although you're physically there, legally you're not counting as if you have arrived. And this has very significant implication in terms of limiting the kind of procedural and substantive rights that asylum seekers and other irregular migrants would otherwise be entitled to under domestic and international law. Now, it also illustrates, because this particular rule is so strict, that it also eliminates the possibility of judicial review, and not only redraws the territorial border, but it also attenuates legality in the process. And this is part of the concern that I raise in the book, to try and explain both the legal and the normative implications of these kinds of very significant changes. And they're very technical changes, but they are very, very significant in terms of their implications. And just to just round up our discussion of Australia, in 2013, when the excision zone was expanded, again through legislation, the idea was that these particular areas that were excised are not sufficient to protect Australia from the perspective of its migration enforcement policy. And the legislation was changed, and now the entire Australian mainland is in effect subject to in effect the excision zone, meaning that the border now applies everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And just to give you a sense, in line with this very hard line that Australia has adopted, those that have actually reached the excision zone recalled. We said legally they're not there, but physically they are there. So the question was, what's going to happen to them? They're asylum seekers. They need to have their claims processed. So Australia created what it calls the offshore processing centers. And here you'll see on the screen, I just put in the image of Nauru, which is a tiny Pacific island. It's 4,500 kilometers away from Australia. And asylum seekers who reach the excision zone are now moved to Nauru, and they might be detained there for years, literally years, while their asylum claim is being processed. And not only that, the final thing which I'll say about Australia, because really it's such a unique and powerful example of the logic of the shifting border operating in practice, Australia has also decided that anyone who tries to reach its border without authorization, that is anyone who fits under the regulation of the excision zone, will never be settled in Australia, even if they have a legitimate asylum claim. This is why you can see the No Way poster, which I included here. And this is part of the idea of deterring human smugglers and irregular migrants from trying to reach Australia's shore. And therefore, in my interpretation, arrival to the excision zone becomes here a black hole. It becomes an original sin. It is something that can never be overcome, even if your basic claim is a legitimate claim. So moving now to the final part of my talk, I hope I've convinced you that these are significant changes. What I want to do is actually, I want to quickly explore with you some of the governmental responses to COVID-19. And I want to build on the shifting border paradigm that I've just discussed with you. So in terms of the data, which is really quite remarkable, by the end of late March, close to 200 countries have imposed full or partial travel bans, de facto engaging in something like self-closure or self-isolation, but at the national level. And this was done by banning either inbound or outbound travel, or in most cases, both. Now, at the height of the crisis, more than 90% of the global population was residing in countries that had introduced these travel restrictions in response to COVID-19. This is absolutely unprecedented, and I actually don't say this as a negative point, just as a factual one, meaning that from what we know, this is quite possible the only point in history where all countries have closed their borders, of course, in relation to a very extreme set of circumstances. So governments would say this was irresponsible and necessary, and is it proportional is a question, but that would be the justification for this response in the face of a global pandemic. But in fact, I think historians of pandemics would tell us that this is unprecedented in the sense that you could interpret this kind of a move as, of course, responding to an immediate public health issue, and connectivity was clearly something important. So cutting that link, flattening the curve, all of those reasons or justifications were brought to the fore. But I think, as I said, perhaps reflecting back, we could also say there was something extraordinary in the idea that governments felt that protecting their citizens, that is putting everyone's life as the first priority, at least in the initial stage of closure, was something that was never done before. And you could actually attribute that to some notions of democracy and equality. You could actually say it means that every government at least felt the obligation to provide some kind of protection for its citizenry under these, or everyone who resides in their countries under these extreme circumstances. Now, for the purposes of our discussion, another interesting question is, how was this done? That is, we know that the borders were closed, but how were the borders closed? And especially, how was this done in such a speedy kind of response? So I want to report to you that none of these legally mandated bans on entry, and in most countries exit as well, required even 1 battalion of soldiers to move to the edge of the territory, as we would have imagined under, where we started, the kind of static traditional border. Not a single sack of cement had to be placed at the border. Instead, government deployed the key rationale of the shifting border to regulate mobility from afar. They have done so by blocking travelers prior to arrival. I just described this to you earlier on with the Canadian example, before they had embarked, before people embarked on a plane heading toward a respective country. And also, and this is new, at least with respect to non-asylum seekers, incoming travelers were also regulated after arrival. That is after they had reached their destination, and in some cases really tracked quite carefully. And if you want to have one concrete example, I'll share it with you. This is an example that actually comes to us from Hong Kong, where individuals who entered Hong Kong were required to wear a wristband that you can see here in the image that we have on the screen, a wristband that is connected to a smartphone app that monitors their movement post-arrival in order to ensure that people are complying with the 14-day mandated quarantine. And in effect, the way in which this worked, once you arrived to your location, it could be a hotel or your home, you had to actually walk around it and had the calibration of where you were, and basically each individual had a digital fence, an individualized digital fence created around them, and that was monitored. If you broke it, you were informed by the authorities that you have left the area that you're permitted to be in. So again, futuristic, but already here. I said previously this would have been science fiction. This is now our new reality, and we have to think through it. What kind of regulations might we want? What kind of accountability do we want? What kind of input do we want to have as participants in our societies in terms of defining these regulations? Currently, they're just made very quickly, swiftly in response to a crisis, but we might want to have some ability to think through these issues, to participate in their decision making, in particular, given the history that we know that once these kinds of new regulations are put in place, it's very hard to undo them, even after the pandemic will be over, hopefully sooner rather than later. So now in the last few minutes that we have, I want to share with you this is a more exploratory component of my talk, which is to try and imagine what the future might hold for international mobility. And really, we are in the realm of speculation here. And I don't have a crystal ball, so what I'm going to share with you is some ideas or some possibilities, and I think we can look back at previous trends to try and predict at least the near future in the sense of the responses to mobility, and now that governments are trying to slowly reopen their economies. So as we're contemplating, different countries are contemplating a partial reopening, what might international travel look like? And here I want to share with you just a few insights and a few developments that we're already witnessing. And of course, we will have to keep a watchful eye to see what the trend is. So one example comes to us from Israel's Ben Gurion Airport. This is an airport that's already known for its strict security protocol, and it's now in the process of developing what's referred to as a seamless check-in, where the idea is that no human agent will be involved. There would be a fleet of robotic cleaners that will sanitize all surfaces in the terminal building, and the idea is that to have all passengers potentially checked for fever. This is actually done not just at Ben Gurion. This is done now. This is the protocol now in every international airport, but that particular airport is trying to develop a platform that will permit determining in real time whether individuals have been tested positive or negative for the virus. And the idea, and this is shared throughout the mobility continuum, that is, various airports are trying to achieve the same goal, which is to create what's referred to as a coronavirus-free transportation hub. And Vienna Airport, just to report to you, has taken a further step. What is their further step? If you arrive to Vienna, to their airport, if you present a medical certificate that says that you have recently taken a COVID-19 test and your results are negative, then you're free to enter the country without quarantine. If you don't have that kind of a negative test response, you would be asked to begin a 14-day quarantine. Some people will arrive without having taken the test. For those individuals, you can take the test at the airport. This is not true, not just for Vienna. Athens provides it, Frankfurt Airport provides it. It's a bit costly. You would have to pay individually, and you will do this while you're still at the airport. You'll have to wait a couple of hours to get your test result. And if the result is positive, you will immediately be transferred to a public health authority. If it's negative, you're permitted to enter without having to undergo the standard quarantine. And for those who, and so you're avoiding the self-isolation period, which might be significant. And for travelers who are traveling onward, that is, let's assume you arrived in Vienna, but your destination is somewhere else in another country, you can show that negative test result. It's valid for 4 days, which means that you can travel onwards. Some airlines are now requiring you to have that kind of a negative test, and some countries are requiring that in order to permit you to board a plane. So this really seems to be the future in the sense of regulating or trying to create a COVID-free mobility zones in which international travel will resume. Now, you can imagine that not everyone will have access to these COVID-free mobility zones. That is, only the healthy will be permitted to move along these sealed off corridors. So this seems to be the new reality that we are facing. And again, we really need to have a discussion about the implications of these changes, which are already taking place, but again, with very, very little discussion. And this, of course, raises a host of legal concerns, ethical concerns about equity, about privacy, about data protection, about surveillance. And I think we can say at this point that clearly COVID-19 is not the great equalizer that it was claimed to be. If anything, we're seeing, I just mentioned health, but we know race, gender, socioeconomic classes, all of these factors seem to exacerbate inequality. And again, given the trends that we are seeing and the responses that we are seeing, it is unlikely that this inequality will be mitigated unless, again, some democratic action or some alternative forms of addressing these issues are discussed, debated, and hopefully undertaken. Now, the last example that I want to share with you, and we can return later on to these issues during the Q&A. But the example that I want to share with you actually has built on some developments that occurred pre-pandemic, that is before COVID, and have only accelerated in its aftermath. So government officials in various countries, China, the United States, Australia, the UK, the United Arab Emirates, Singapore, just to mention a few, were quite keen even prior to the pandemic to imagine a future whereby arriving and departing passengers will not require any travel document. That is, instead, our body will become our ticket of admission, or conversely, what marks us for denial of entry as biometric borders expand their reach. So if you want to have one concrete example, we have it on the screen. Dubai International Airport, its Terminal 3, has already introduced a pilot test, which is referred to as a new biometric border. In that particular airport, it's known as a smart tunnel. And when you walk through this tunnel, it identifies passengers through a combination of scans, which refer to our iris scan, face recognition, and this occurs as you walk through the tunnel that you see in the picture. Now here we currently have the image that you have is of a city. Oftentimes they will have an aquarium setting, which means that fish will move, or images of fish will move, which naturally draws your eye to look at it. So you're getting a better view, a better vision. There are more than 80 cameras embedded in that particular tunnel to make sure that the biometric identification is correct. But here again, as we spoke earlier on about the potential future of travel, no passport is required, no human interaction is required. You're just passing through, and here a very sophisticated technological system will determine whether you can get in or whether you are blocked. And if we still have a minute, Allison, I just want to share one last example. And just for your information, the kind of examples that I'm describing to you appear in the Courier, the UNESCO Courier, the latest issue of their particular magazine, which is actually the most well-read, I learned, UN publication, and it appears in the 6 official languages of the UN, so it's really quite great. So I have included one of my pieces appears there. It's called Shifting Borders, Invisible but Very Real. So it's online. If you want to download it, you're welcome to read about some of these more futuristic aspects of the shifting border. So I just want to share with you one last example. Again, equally futuristic and unnerving, comes to us from Europe. A couple of years ago, the European Union funded a pilot project entitled iBorder Control. And this high-tech system is designed to pre-screen incoming travelers who are required to, and I'm quoting, perform a short, automated, non-invasive interview with an avatar and undergo a lie detector. Now, the iBorder Control units are tasked with the responsibility of verifying the identity of the travelers and to calculate a cumulative risk factor for each individual. Now, that risk factor will later appear in any future border crossing and may lead to further checks or even denial of entry. And the border control avatar, it's an artificial intelligence machine, is trained specifically to detect human deception and is looking for what's referred to as micro gestures. That is very subtle, nonverbal, facial, and bodily cues that none of us can control. So the territorial border, just summing up, is not just shifting inward as out and outward as in the examples that I've shared with you at the beginning of my talk, but it's also multiplying. It's fracturating. Each person, each one of us might in the future carry the border with us as we move across space and time. And let me close with the following thought. As these examples illustrate, borders are not vanishing, but they are transforming. The shifting border is at once, it's multi-directional, it's slippery, but not in the transnational, open, and tolerant variant that the demise of the border or post-Westphalian theories had foreseen. Instead, a darker, more restrictive orientation has emerged, and far from the dream of a borderless world that has emerged after the Berlin Wall came down, today we find not only more border walls erected across the globe on fault lines, but also the rapid proliferation of movable legal barriers, barriers that apply selectively and unevenly with fluctuating degree, intensity, and frequency of regulation. So no longer a static barrier, the border has become a mobile, agile, sophisticated, ever-transforming legal construct, a shifting border, which can be planted and replanted in different locations with dramatic implications for the rights and protections of everyone who falls under its remit, basically every one of us currently. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop here. I think we're precisely on time, and I very much look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ayelet, for that absolutely fascinating talk. So this is a great time to open up the event to questions from the audience. So if you haven't already done so, do type your questions into the questions option of the event dashboard. So our first question from an audience member is, could you share your thoughts on how the shifting border might implicate on the notion of citizenship as exclusive right/property as state-citizen relationship?
It's a great question. It's actually a very difficult one. I think there are different ways to think about it. One which I'm concerned about, I'm actually going to pick up on some of the last comments that I've delivered to you, the question of this individualized border. One of the things, and this is the external dimension of citizenship, what we would call that is, let's assume you're traveling on a particular passport, and let's assume that your country is a well-off country. So typically you would have visa waiver entry, you would have a significant amount of freedom of mobility. If the border now is individualized, if it's embedded in our body, it could be that despite the fact that you might have a very coveted passport, your mobility might be restricted, and it might be restricted, we mentioned most directly on questions of health. But I'm also very worried that once we turn to these more automated review processes, at least some of the data shows that we need to be concerned about questions of racial identity. We need to be concerned about gender. We need to be concerned about socioeconomic status. So these are all things which have not yet unfolded, or they're unfolding in front of our eyes. But I do think that part of what citizenship granted you as an individual was that protection that you have, say, your nationality, and that travels with you and to some extent protects you for other people. It might actually make you quite vulnerable. But I think that is fracturing, and I think we really have to think through this. This is a new development. In terms of the internal interaction between individuals and their governments, I think the kind of discussion that I started with, the sipping into the territory, that is the notion that the border, which once used to be fixed and was limited in time and space, the fact that it's now expanding so dramatically, that might also lead you to precisely these kinds of concerns. That is, if everyone could potentially be stopped within a country, you might be very worried about the kind of choices that are made by the officials that are actually regulating or are doing the implementing this idea of the regulation. I would want to see the data. I'm sure that it would actually mean that, say, in the United States, it would be very plausible that ethnic minorities would be subject to a much greater regulation than other individuals. So we are potentially seeing this breakdown of the universality, internal universality and equality that in my opinion makes citizenship worth protecting. So I have to say these are very significant developments, especially if you add to them something which I don't do in the Shifting Border book, but I do in my other work, is to think about also economic criteria for entry. And if you think about cultural regulation of, even if you are within the territory, we know that some long-term migrants will have a much harder time complying with the new set of civic integration and citizenship tests that most countries have introduced. So I think we really need to have a very holistic discussion, and definitely a critical one, and to try to understand what I'm calling in my work outside this particular book, or my new, really, this is my new book project, is what I'm calling the transformation of citizenship. So thank you. It's a great question. It really requires a much more elaborate set of discussions, but I hope I've given you a gist of the direction that I would take this.
Thank you very much, Ayelet. And we have another question. Thank you. This is so fascinating. I'm interested in borders as liminal spaces. Would shifting borders mean that the liminal becomes enormously expanded, that more and more people are neither here nor there? Should we understand it as ways of surveillance that in a way negate borders and place people under extreme state control all the time, wherever they are and whether or not they are citizens of that state?
Yeah, again, a great question. And yes, I think because we're at this is a transition moment. So I think we're seeing, and this is partly what disturbs me and motivated me to write this book, first to sort of get the word out there and to have a term that actually describes this new phenomenon. I do agree that you could definitely, the dystopian narrative would absolutely, you nailed it head on in the sense of the question. That is, it could be constant surveillance. It could be anyone who's in the territory. So again, blurring the kind of protections that citizens once had in relation to other individuals. So instead of leveling up, this is a leveling down. Everyone would be surveilled all the time. Your mobility might be tracked. Again, if we're moving to these the micro gesture kind of reviews, they're even more dangerous because they really are, some have referred to them as under the skin kind of regulation. You really cannot hide them. So I think there is, in that sense, there's a real dystopian story to be told. I think the interesting question is, will we see a pushback? That is, once this becomes, I don't think that states are going to give up these new sets of regulatory powers that they have given themselves, really. So my thought is we can't go back to some kind of a past where the border will only really be on that strict fortified static line, as we can imagine, as the line on the atlas. That is the classic Westphalian image, really. I don't think we're going to go back there, but the question is, are there any abilities to try and regulate and to try to suggest, well, you might need to have to give a reason for regulating and surveilling your citizens. Now, this is not a good time to do this because COVID actually pushes us in precisely the other direction, right? You might say you need to test individuals, you need to trace them, you need to know if they're in isolation. And again, and it's not just governments here, it's also very, very powerful economic interests and tech companies which have the know-how and the expertise. So I think we're facing a multiple set of factors here, but definitely I'm glad that you raised this question because these liminal spaces are significant to think through. And as I said, we really need to, first of all, think about this as scholars, but also as participants in our societies and globally in any transnational discussion about these issues, because clearly we need first to have the vocabulary, then we need to think about to specify what we believe might be problematic here. Are we seeing, some have suggested that we're really seeing a kind of erosion of democratic government that's becoming more like an authoritarian government if you really have the surveillance, especially 24/7, without need to provide a reason to do so. So I actually think there's a whole amount of thinking that we need to do. And then potentially you might actually even think about civil society or political responses. But I think, first of all, partly my motivation was really just to spell this out, to say this is an issue and it doesn't seem like it's going to go away. And as I said, this was pre-COVID. If anything, I think these questions are far more pressing and immediate now. And also, as I mentioned earlier, if we don't act now, this might just become embedded in our both daily and regulatory, meaning legislative framework. And I think we really should be worried about. That is, once it's in, it's very, very hard to take out these regulations. So if they're introduced, they should be done as emergency measures, as temporary measures. They must have a sunshine clause. If there's a regulation of our data, for example, the question of the architecture of even the tracing is significant. Is the data remaining on your cell phone or on your smartphone, or does it go to a central government agency? Does it get erased after after a while, or is it there forever and ever? And then a digital profile can be built around you, and it might just not cover COVID, it might cover other issues as well. So I think these are all open questions, and hopefully if there's some people in the audience that are intrigued by this, please, take this up in your own work and run with it. I think we just really need to think through these issues thoroughly, seriously, and creatively.
Thank you very much, Ayelet. We have another question. Would it be possible to ask Professor Shachar when approximately she dates the emergence of this shifting or mobile form of bordering? The push away from national borders seems to happen as early as the 1920s and 1930s in Canada and the US, with efforts to assess the eligibility and worthiness of migrants at the source, e.g. medical checkup, visa procedures, or relocated in countries of departure.
Well, to some extent, you can say that this is, this is an interesting question, because always we get these questions when we talk about migration, mobility, borders, citizenship, because to some extent you can say this has always been there, but I think there are some very distinctive factors that we can say that are novel. So even if there was some regulation at the point of departure, it probably was much more minimal, in the sense that most of the regulation would have occurred, at least in Canada and the United States. In the United States, Ellis Island is famous precisely for that, right? That's where you actually had the officials sort of say, yes, you're in, you're out. And part of it was actually on medical grounds. There were other grounds where they could exclude. So partly the weight of the regulation would have occurred actually at the point of arrival rather than departure, even though you can say that with the invention of the passport and with the invention of the idea of a visa, you're already seeing you're seeing the seeds of the kind of developments that we have today. But I think partly what you really need in order to have the kind of really global reach that the shifting border currently has, you also need to have a much greater state capacity. You need to have, to some extent, technology. You need to have the ability to regulate and to stretch your border in the sense of not just as an idea, but as the capacity to do so. To some extent in Europe, it's very interesting, because there we're seeing the opening of the internal borders is also, as you know, many scholars have tracked that, also has led to a greater concern about the external borders. And there you can see that it's an interesting correlation. That is, do we think that in order to get greater mobility for those who are already in the more privileged parts of the world in terms of the internal mobility or free mobility within, say, the European Union, Schengen, etc., do you actually, is the cost, so to speak, that of regulating and limiting mobility for those who might wish to come from the outside, whose claims might actually be more pressing? So these are real serious issues that we need to take into account. I think in terms of timing, it's interesting that you asked that, because you could think about the United States, for example, regulating or pushing back, interdicting Haitian migrants who were escaping Haiti as the point where you would say the shifting border really becomes a technique that's identifiable. You would also have government officials who would say, we wanted to maintain the discretion. We might not necessarily even take advantage of it or what we might term abuse it. We just wanted to have the ability to be able to regulate individuals extraterritorially. So I think this is the kind of, so you're right that we could go back to the 20s, 30s, but I think the more kind of techniques that I'm referring to, and again, the element of capacity, I would probably put it actually post-World War II, but definitely a couple of decades. And again, we might want to look at specific examples. I think the idea, though, that the notion or the logic, which I think is partly what we need to think about, the idea that states would like to regulate who gets in. We know that that's very closely connected to the idea of a state's right to exclude as a sovereign right, and we know that political philosophers have debated that for ages now. But the element here of the ability to do so is just more extensive, it's more expansive, and it does require states also to do something which I think is explaining the shifting border, is that if you look at the leaders, the countries that have really pushed this kind of regulation, even examples that I've given you, the United States, Canada, and Australia. So, bar for a second the current US situation, generally these are countries that would see themselves as leaders in the sense of human rights and would try to claim their position as beacons of democracy globally. Now, it is these very same countries that are trying to skirt their obligations. So they're not saying we don't have an obligation, say, to refugees or asylum seekers who reach our territory. We would have to start a process. What we're doing is we're basically keeping our promise potentially, but de facto we're making it impossible to arrive. So I think countries here are playing a very, they're playing this dual game. They're saying we wish to uphold our rights, and indeed, actually, if you get into the territory, you will get in most countries. Again, barring the Australian example that I've showed you, but if you flew into Australia and then claimed asylum, you would have a full asylum hearing, and even your chance of success would be high. It's also true in Canada. So it's just a question. So we're seeing this duality, and I think that's part of the story that we need to understand, because if it's just a story that says these countries are just breaching all rights, etc., you know, the kind of dystopian narrative, which I think we can tell, but I think for me it's more interesting to also see the counter narratives. And I think in some cases there's definitely a push. If you think about human rights organizations, they have done tremendous amount of litigation, even especially mostly actually in the European Court of Human Rights, trying to say you cannot just extraterritorially block refugees and asylum seekers. And we know that this was indeed the decision of the European Court of Human Rights, at least in reference to Italy and Libya. So we also have, I think what we need to see is this wholesome picture, and partly the motivation and the logic. So I think countries will absolutely continue to try and regulate mobility. I think in the current political climate, that is, if we take the populist nationalist push, for sure they would also try and they will be harsher on some groups than others. So I think we have to, this is why I said we really need to have a holistic discussion here about what remains available in the rhetoric of the emancipatory rhetoric of citizenship, which is a strong tradition, and what are we seeing in the sense of state practice, and how do we bridge that gap, or just point it out, and then if we want to contest it, what kind of sources, ideas, in practical action can we take? So I really think we need to have this wholesome discussion, and putting it in a longer time horizon, I think actually empowers us in the sense of saying this is not new, but the techniques and the scope and the scale of operation is so much greater that this is much more pressing now than it was in the past.
Thank you very much. I think we've got time for one final question. So an audience member has said, thank you. Can existing or new international institutions combat this regulatory overreach by the state? Would they have to have coercive powers? Is this a realistic and worthwhile avenue to advocate for?
Okay, thank you. All your questions are just so fabulous. I'm really sorry I can't sort of see you in person and engage with you. So hopefully you're getting a gist of my sort of commitment and energy to these questions. And maybe at some point in time, once we're permitted to travel again, and I don't know, we could have a follow-up meeting. But in terms of your question, I actually definitely think it's worth exploring ideas of what we might call a pushback or resistance, or taming this kind of and I think you're right, it's overreach. And I think also countries are just trying to escape regulation. And if we had more time, I would have told you about some of the techniques where even some of the, you know, even the EU-Turkey agreement, for example, was something that was challenged before the courts. But the court said, no, this is not really an international agreement. We can't really review this. So there are also questions of the techniques that are done to avert the kind of even standard legal procedures that we have for trying to at least review and at least challenge these kinds of new responses that we're seeing by governments. But I think your question is deeper. You're asking about transnational, international action. You're asking about perhaps new institutions. I think one thing which I think there is actually a pretty strong consensus in the literature. Clearly, the way in which, and this really doesn't refer to COVID, this refers more narrowly to the question, say, of asylum seekers who are blocked from entry, and partly the legal regime that we have globally is such that you need to arrive to the territory. It's referred to as territorial arrival. You actually have to get to the territory or the border or near the border of that country in order to be able to claim asylum and begin the protection process, which can be a very long process. So the concern, I think, that is partly explaining the rise of the shifting border is the fact that the system that we have, in fact, is really quite unfair. That is, it really means that countries that are very close to an area of crisis, we notice in the global south, would be the ones that carry most of the brunt or responsibility of caring for individuals. They might be the countries that, in terms of finance, in terms of logistics, in terms of the concerns that they have about carrying their own citizens, are not in the best position to do so. But this is partly the world in which we live in. The vast majority of migrants, asylum seekers and refugees, never ever reach the wealthier parts of the world. So those who do manage to make territorial arrival are the ones that the shifting border is trying to regulate. So then I think what we really need, if we want to address this, is first to say, you know, if you're looking at the European context, it's true that the frontier countries, the southern countries, Italy, Greece, etc., are carrying a much heavier responsibility. And you could say, well, if there is a European asylum protection system, as there is, you would think that that's your first place to say, well, perhaps we should have more shared responsibility. Perhaps it's just not the geographical location of a country, which is the country of first arrival. And you might want to think about greater mechanisms for redistribution in the sense of fair shared responsibility sharing, which would mean that other countries, even if they're not the country of first arrival, would have to take responsibility. I would think that's a first step. So maybe start it regionally, but globally, I also think we would have to have that discussion. We might think about resettlement. There are different ways that we can think about this. And the question of coerciveness or not, first, I think we need to create that regime. First, you need to have the buy-in of countries in order to actually have something like a resettlement program writ large. That is with many individuals saying, even if you arrive to one country, you might be able to move to another. I have to say, my vision, because the kind of response that I would want to do, it's a little bit hard to do, but I'll just share it with you. And I know we're running out of time, so I'll do this quickly. My idea is the following, and I elaborate that in the book, so you're welcome to read it. I think what countries are trying to do is really, as I mentioned earlier, they're playing an unfair game. They're saying, if we extend our reach in the sense of we can use our regulatory powers, we can use our power to determine who gets in, potentially anywhere in the world, right? That's the shifting border. And we have created techniques that permit us to do this. But they're also saying, although I'm now acting anywhere in the world, my set of responsibilities, which typically would come with the exercise of governmental authority, does not follow. And I think that is just, it's incoherent. And also it really, it challenges our basic rule of law conceptions. That is, you can't exercise authority without some degree of responsibility. So I think partly what I would try to do, and again, this is different than a global model of responsibility sharing, although I think that's definitely something worth fighting for, is I think we already have in our repertoire of thinking about the state and its exercise of authority, we have invented, fortunately, some ways to actually regulate governmental authority. It can't just be arbitrary, it can't be capricious, it can't systemically harm particular groups. So I think we can also draw on these ideas and say, if power is exercised extraterritorially or deep into the territory in the sense of a border now operating anywhere and everywhere, then we have to have much, much greater ability to bring the kind of constitutional protections, the human rights protections, all the kinds of theories that we have about how to regulate state power. And that should also be applicable if the state is shifting its exercise of authority irrespective of geography, then so should responsibility follow suit. And I think that would give us a tremendous way to actually try and counter this. Now, how can we do this? That is, how do we get from this idea, the principle, to the application? I think there's a tremendous amount of work that we need to do. But I happen to be one of the believers that the first thing we need is good ideas. That is, at least we need to have a direction forward, then we'll figure out how to get there. But partly, and again, this is the motivation for this book, we need to understand what the concern is. We need to really be very specific about the techniques which are used by states. And as I said, it's not just states, they're acting together, supranational entities. So I would not just put everything on the states here. They are part of a larger, they're smart enough to actually bring in a lot of partners. And as I mentioned, also third parties, commercial parties, corporate parties. So we really need to take that whole picture into account. But once we do, I think we really can say, this is what is going on. It's a new technique of bordering. So you can't just use the enforcement powers without the responsibilities and obligations that come with being a responsible government. So as I said, I think there is actually a lot of work to be done, but the principle is actually quite clear. At least in my mind, it's clear, and I think it's enforceable. And I think we even have within our traditions of democracy, within our legal traditions, within our emancipatory visions, and within our ideas of how we justify the exercise of state authority, we have the resources. It's just that we need to be creative about how to take those principles, which really were thought of as operating in a much more stable kind of bounded territory, bounded space. And what is happening now is that we have, if the border, as I have claimed, really broke away from the map, then also our kind of protections, the kind of inventions that we have created need to follow suit. So that would be another sort of set of ideas, and really that you're welcome to read in the book. And as I said, I really hope we'll have a chance, all of you who have tuned into it at one point or another. I present globally, and I really, once that is permitted again, hopefully we could also catch up. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ayelet. Okay, I think this is a great moment to wrap up this armchair event and thank everyone for attending. And also thank you, Ayelet, for giving up your time to participate in this MEP armchair event.